Chipotle stock just had one of its worst days ever. Since the new CEO took over, the company has been missing Wall Street's expectations for the last several quarters now. But this latest sell off hit different. The stock has fallen nearly 50% from its peak last December, but even back in July, shares were sitting above $58. Now they're in the low 30s. Customers and investors are starting to lose patience. But it was what the CEO said on the earnings call that really came as a surprise to me, because it sounded more like a genuine warning about where the US economy is headed.
We've seen a pretty sizable step down in the consumer that's under $100,000 in annual income. Specific to that is a group, the 25 to 34-year-old, which we over-index to, has pulled back measurably.
Now, some people don't consider Chipotle to be fast food in the traditional sense, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to. There are over 3,500 Chipotle locations today, so it's much closer to fast food than it is to your local mom and pop restaurant. And as I've talked about over the last year, fast food has seen some pretty serious declines. Some chains have frankly done way better than others, and previously Chipotle was one of those, but now it's clear they're definitely feeling the pain here too. Chipotle CEO Scott Boatwright said they're seeing fewer visits across all income levels, but the pullback is sharpest among customers making under $100,000 a year, a group that makes up about 40% of their customer base. Now that stat surprised me because it means roughly 60% of Chipotle's customers earn more than $100K a year, which probably reflects households rather than individuals, but still, it shows how dependent the brand has become on higher earners. And even that group isn't spending like they used to. Boatwright also pointed out that 25 to 34-year-olds are particularly stretched, citing unemployment, student loan repayments, and slower real wage growth as potential problems for them. Chipotle actually over-indexes toward that demographic, the younger generation, which makes this even more concerning, and it's partially why the story caught my interest in the first place. But at least here he's being somewhat honest about what's really going on. Younger Americans are struggling to get ahead in ways their parents and grandparents frankly didn't have to. Analysts who cover Chipotle stock had some pretty out-of-touch things to say about their quarter, like, quote, "We're admittedly perplexed by how suddenly this traffic weakness came about, and not convinced affordability concerns are the main driver here." Yeah, people going less has nothing to do with the meal being $20. Okay. Another analyst expressed concerns that, quote, "the menu and marketing actions taken so far have not sufficiently offset the traffic retraction." Personally, I disagree. I don't think this has anything to do with marketing. Now, despite consumers pulling back, Chipotle's CEO said value as a price point is not and will not be a Chipotle strategy. This means Chipotle will not be leaning into any sort of value meals or discounted pricing, which historically speaking, they haven't really ever done, so it's not a complete shocker to me, but it does speak to how they may not be out of the woods here. They've taken many price hikes since the pandemic, and several of the complaints that I see are that it's just not a good deal anymore. $11 to $14 for just the burrito, not including any chips or drink. So a meal can easily creep towards $20 if you add in those things, and depending on what area you're in. That is by no means cheap. Their attempts at value, if you even want to call it that, have always felt incredibly hollow. Like for instance, I saw one the other day that said if you come in on Halloween between the hours of like 3 and 6 p.m. and you dress up in a costume, they'll give you half off your burrito. It's just silly stuff like that that most people aren't even going to bother with, let alone even know about. They also rolled out this build your own Chipotle offer, where basically you can get their catering for 4 to 6 people, but it starts at $60. If that's serving 4 people, that's $15 a person before drinks. And once again, that's also not a deal. That's just repurposing something they already offer on the menu, which was catering for larger groups. And unfortunately, this feels all too common in the corporate playbook these days. Try to do everything but the obvious thing, which would be lower prices, or at the very least, find a way to give people more of a reason to come in more often.
Chipotle is trying to blame the macro, But, this is largely self-inflicted in our view. I mean, if you look at the other earnings that have been released, Shake Shack this morning had a great print. Restaurant Brands, which owns, Burger King, Tim Hortons, Popeyes, had a very good print. Domino's, Chili's are crushing it right now. So, for them to come out and blame low-income consumers, which they have a very low exposure to, as well as Gen Z, which, there's some anecdotal stuff out there about how Gen Z employment isn't great. But, the survey data that we see is showing that Gen Z is spending more than other age cohorts and expect to spend more next year. So it's really, I think, largely self-inflicted.
Now, I want to be clear, this isn't a brand new problem for Chipotle. It's just finally happened to reach a breaking point. And in my opinion, I'm honestly surprised it didn't happen sooner. About a year and a half ago, Chipotle had to admit it quietly reduced portion sizes. Customers had been complaining about this online for a while, showing smaller scoops of protein, less rice, less everything, frankly. And Chipotle finally addressed the shrinkflation with an awkward interview with their now former CEO, and by also trying to make an attempt at giving bigger portions, or at the very least, the same size as they used to be. However, in the following quarters, they admitted that this ended up decreasing their profit margins. Now, obviously, people aren't dumb. They notice when companies shrink portion sizes. When your burrito costs more and fills you up less, you start thinking twice about whether it's even worth it. So between price hikes and smaller portions, Chipotle has created its own traffic problem. To make matters worse, there's a real possibility the ongoing government shutdown is amplifying this slowdown. It's already been shut down over a month, and about 1.5 million federal employees and contractors are now either furloughed or working without pay. That's a huge chunk of middle-class spending power suddenly frozen. Now, generally speaking, when people aren't getting paychecks, one of the first things to go is something like eating out. But it's obviously not just the government shutdown here. A lot of Americans are already stretched thin. Credit card balances are at record highs, rent and insurance costs are through the roof, and even as Chipotle stated, wage growth has not kept up with inflation. What's wild here is Chipotle is essentially saying, we're not lowering prices, deal with it. They seem to think their brand is too strong to be significantly affected here, which, in my opinion, is a dangerous mindset to have. I think the bigger picture here is what this says about the K-shaped economy. You've got the upper leg, big tech companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google posting record profits and surging stock prices, all while they lay off workers and spend billions of dollars on AI investments. But on the lower leg, you've got companies like Chipotle, McDonald's, and several others, all warning about the same thing, consumer strain. The middle and lower segments of the economy are slowing down, even as the top keeps thriving. So when Chipotle says customers are stretched, they're not wrong, but they're also not victims here. They price themselves out of reach for a lot of the very customers who built their brand in the first place. And now that decision is just catching up to them. It's just another example of a big public company chasing endless growth. But there are a lot of other economic factors going on in this perfect storm. Small businesses in particular are being crushed right now. And I covered what's going on with them in this video here. So please check it out next. Thanks for watching.